Good afternoon. We're here to talk about a subject that I've been harping on since I got here a little over 5 years ago. Senator Scott and I came in from two responsible states that always do these things anyway. I want to give you a little description of how far we've come in such a short period of time. I think we were $18 trillion in debt in 2018. It took us a long time to get there. We hardly had any money borrowed as a country until the Bush administration in 2000 added $5 trillion. Obama 6 had 5 cumulatively up to the Bush administration. It was 16 after the end of Obama's term. 18 when I got there in 18. Now it's 34 trillion, getting close to 35. It's going so fast it may have already gotten there. So this is about the fact that we don't do budgets anymore. We're gotten real comfortable of whatever your party wants. You make the deal with the other side of the aisle. It's the unholy alliance here. And we merrily go down the road of stacking up now $1 trillion every 6 months. That's $2 trillion a year. And remember, back in 18, it was at $1 trillion a year. You extrapolate that into the future, and President Biden has actually had the nerve to do it. It's going to put our country $52 trillion $52 trillion in debt in 9 to 10 years. If you're good at math, take our current interest rates, see how much that would be. It's going to eclipse what we spend on defense, on domestic discretionary, and it's going to run the country into a ditch we've never seen before. That is the big picture. Career politicians that have never signed the front side of a paycheck, that come here, want to run the biggest business in the world, and don't have the political will to fix this stuff. Any other place, you'd have to do it constitutionally with a balanced budget amendment in your state, a statute, or just your good common sense. And term limits would be another thing we've got to get here sooner or later as part of the solution. We're going to talk today about a particularly obnoxious part of it, and that would be earmarks. That would be something that we actually had the will to get rid of not too many years ago, crept back up in the House, bipartisan, so it's a bipartisan issue we have. And now in the Senate, you can do them if you want to, even though you're technically, as a caucus, against it. These guys are going to talk about some of the most egregious ones. They don't amount to all that much money, but they are symbolic of a broken system, and one, unless future generations say enough is enough, because I don't think you want to pay all this money back. It'd be your kids and grandkids having to carry that load. Look at what some of these earmarks amount to. I'm going to turn it over to Senator Scott. Rick, go ahead and fill them in.
So I grew up in public housing. My parents had to watch every dime they got. There was no extra money around. They had to scrape by just to put food on the table. If they had any earthly idea what their federal government was doing now, they would be livid. Just the unbelievable, just complete waste. I balanced the budget when I was governor every year. We had not balanced the budget in Florida for 20 straight years before I became governor. I looked at every line item in the budget. If it wasn't getting a return, I vetoed it. We've got to figure out how to stop this wasteful spending. We have almost $35 trillion worth of debt, and this is not sustainable. So, but let's look at this spending bill that we, of course, like everything else we get up here, we get at the last minute. Without any input from us, without the ability to amend it, without any of these things. Let's talk about some of these earmarks. And they're just wasteful spending that somebody gets to put into the budget. This time it's over 6,000 earmarks. Now this is less, I think it's a little bit less than half of half the spending bills. I think it's a little bit less than half of our entire annual spending. 6,000 earmarks, $12 billion. This makes zero sense. Let me give you some examples. Chuck Schumer gets in $1 million to build a new environmental justice center in New York City. Now, how many voters in Florida think that's a great idea? How about $1 million for Pelosi to bring back to San Francisco social justice program? And then $3.5 million to keep to make floats for a Thanksgiving Day parade in Michigan, and $4 million for a waterfront walkway in New Jersey. Now, think about it. All those states, guess what's consistent? A lot of people left those states to come to Florida. They didn't come to Florida to have their tax dollars go waste money like this. They know in Florida we're trying to watch their money so we don't have to raise their taxes and make sure we don't have massive amounts of debt. So I'm going to continue to fight this, make sure everybody knows what's in this bill. We need to take more time, and we need to be able to get rid of this wasteful spending. If we don't do this, there's no way inflation is going away. We already know it's almost 18% since Biden got elected. Wages are not stay up with inflation. Inflation will not go away until we balance the budget and stop this wasteful spending. Now let me turn it over to Senator Mike Lee.
It was with good reason that in 2010, shortly after I got elected to the Senate Republican Conference convened. A number of us hadn't even been sworn in yet. Senator Rand Paul and I were part of that class of 2010. Senator Pat Toomey, Marco Rubio, a handful of others. A lot of us had been elected against a backdrop that was very hostile toward earmarks, and with very good reason. For that reason, before we were even sworn in, we met as a conference, and the conference voted. We voted to adopt a ban on earmarks. The House Republican Conference did essentially the same thing at essentially the same time. And this stuck for a number of years, more or less. You know, aberrations here or there, but it stuck. It is still the conference, the conference policy of the Senate Republican Conference that we are opposed to earmarks. And yet we're returning to it. We're returning to it to our own detriment, but especially to the detriment of the American people. And it tends to remind me, my family hates it when I quote this scripture, but Proverbs 26:11, as a dog returns to its vomit, so a fool returns to its folly. When you turn back to something that's familiar, that you're backsliding into a familiar but unhealthy position, that's what occurs. And so when we have an earmark-laden bill and Republicans start heading headlong into it, notwithstanding our ongoing conference policy against earmarks, it reminds me of dogs, albeit dogs dressed as elephants returning to their vomit. That's not appropriate. It's not good for our voters. It's not good for the people we represent, whether they voted for us or not. Because look at what it produces. Look at what it does. We've got about 650 pages tacked onto this bill of just straight earmarks. Of those 650 or so pages, you've got over 6,000 separate earmarks. And there's a wide range of them. Look, I'm sure some of them fund good things that will benefit good people. And I'm sure some of them at least satisfy a part of that, but aren't necessarily the prerogative of the federal government. The purpose here is not to adjudicate each and every project on its own merits as to whether it should be funded by someone. The question is whether it should be funded by government, and in particular this government. And if it should be funded by this government, why not subject it to negotiation, discussion, an amendment process, debate under the light of day in which this can occur, rather than opening this up, foisting it upon the American people at the 11th hour, just a matter of days before it's to be voted on. And then we're told, oh, by the way, you can't really change this. You can't really change it unless it's something we want to change. We, meaning the self-appointed custodians of the bill and the highest-ranking appropriators in the Senate when it comes to taking out things that they don't want. So the bill involves a total of $470 billion. Of that, $12.7 billion involves earmarks. Now, a lot of people are fond of saying in this circumstance, well, it's just a small percentage. It's a tiny percentage of American GDP, still a small percentage of what we spend overall, and still a pretty small percentage even of just domestic, discretionary, non-defense spending. Whatever. Look, the fact remains, it may not be the entire length of the train, or even measurable as half or a quarter of or a third of the train, but it's what's driving the train. This is why we're $34 trillion and counting in debt, is because members, seeing that there is a bill that's too big, that's too expensive, that funds too many things, are more likely to vote for something if you adopt what they sometimes call sweeteners. These addictive, corrupting substances within the bill that allow you to come home to your home constituencies or to this or to that special interest and say, I brought home the bacon. So why, for example, is it that we're being asked to provide some, I don't know, $850 million to Georgetown University? No, that one's not $850 million. That one is $963,000. $963,000, nearly $1 million, to Georgetown University. Now, Georgetown University has an endowment. Just in its endowment alone is over $3.2 billion. Why are we giving that to Georgetown? Why? Why likewise are we giving $850,000 to a left-wing entity called the New Immigrant Community Empowerment Center that's going to use that to build, and I believe the correct terminology is a coffee house, a coffee shop, and a greenhouse? That may be great. I don't know why that greenhouse and that coffee shop are being constructed by government, being constructed by this government with this government's funding, without it seeing the light of day. And so, a few of us went down to the floor to raise some objections to these, and also to another one to spend $2.5 million for outdoor recreation, specifically kayaking and slalom activities for the town of Franklin, New Hampshire. Those are fun things. They're great. People want to have the ability to do them. Why is the U.S. taxpayer being forced to work months out of every year just to pay his or her federal taxes, only to be told it's not nearly enough because we're $34.5 trillion in debt? And by the way, we're going to have to make you throw in $2.5 million for these recreational activities, kayaking and slalom activities in Franklin, New Hampshire. I do not know, but these things, we're told, can't be debated. We tried to have them removed. I tried to strike them, and I was told by the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, sorry, no can do. This is a hermetically sealed chamber. It's been a finely wrought compromise, and there is no changing it now. Only there's a problem. They have been making changes. They made a change last night. They made a change after it was discovered that they had set aside $1 million for what's been characterized as funding for BDSM sex parties. And they were embarrassed to defend that, so Senator Murray went to the floor and had that removed. So apparently it can be opened up. It's just it can be opened up and changed only for things that she cares about. This is a mess. And no sane person would say that the governing body of any organization, whether it's a corporation and its board of directors, a state legislature, or the legislative branch of the United States government, should operate like this, where the single most important type of decision it makes, a funding decision to keep the entity funded, in this case in about half of the budget categories, should be made by a small handful of people who negotiate behind closed doors, expecting the Senate and the House as a whole to just rubber stamp what they've done and to tell them, little peasants, go away. We, the people who negotiated this, are the only ones who can touch it. That's insulting to the American people, and it's going to perpetuate the problem. So I'm going to turn it over now to my friend and colleague, the senator from Kansas, Roger Marshall.
Mike, thanks so much. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. What we have is a broken budget and appropriations process up here. And this is the next installment in this particular book. The Appropriations Committee did their job. They got all their 12 appropriation bills done sometime, I believe, the end of July. It wasn't until October that those were brought to the Senate floor, a handful of them, 2 or 3 of them brought to the floor, and nothing since then. And certainly it was in September where most of us standing here predicted that we would end up where we are today with omnibuses, minibuses. And then the problem with these minibuses, we said then and we say today, is that you're going to see bridges to nowhere that have never seen the light of day. That when these bills don't come to the floor one at a time, there's not an opportunity to expose these earmarks for what they are and to go through them one at a time in front of the American public and shed the light on them and let members of the Senate defend exactly what's in it and what's not in it. And I think if there was that opportunity, a lot of these would be taken off the Senate floor. So this system is indeed so very broken. And at the end of the day, we're $34 trillion in debt, but that seems to not be a concern up here. That they operate on this cost-plus system, and there's solutions out there. There's solutions like going to zero-based budgeting. There's solutions like having a surgical strike to remove these one at a time without destroying the rest of the bill. So I think what you're going to see from us in the future is legislation that would define a new budget process with teeth in it, so we wouldn't end up here. Every one of us has ran businesses. We run our own Senate offices with a budget. We need a budget up here, and then follow that budget and get towards work towards a balanced budget process. It can be done. I guarantee it can be done. It's going to be painful, but meanwhile, the American taxpayers, our grandchildren, are going to be stuck with this budget that we're living on now. Thanks so much.
We can take any questions anybody has. Go ahead.
Thanks for taking my question. Do any of you plan to push for amendment votes to the mini bus, either to strip out earmarks or otherwise?
Yeah, we're pushing for those.
Yeah.
And we hope to get some opportunity to do that. I don't know whether we'll have them. Think about this for a minute, by the way. It's kind of sad. It would even be in doubt. In any legislative body that takes its obligation seriously to represent its constituents, it's unthinkable that you'd have something that spends this amount of money, that's this important, that wouldn't have a robust amendment process. Shoot, when you're talking about funding roughly half the budget categories, this ought to be on the floor for weeks, open for amendments. What does that tell you about their level of confidence in the ability of this legislation to withstand public scrutiny under the light of day? It doesn't bode well for their own confidence in their own work product. But yes, we're going to negotiate as best we can to get access to at least some amendments. Whatever crumbs they're willing to throw us under the table, we'll have to fight for.
So Rick and I are on the budget committee, have been since,
too.
and Mike is too. And we have not had one hearing the entirety of this year, unless I'm forgetting, on budget mechanics. We haven't even talked about a budget resolution, which is just the top line. So we do nothing in terms of the mechanics of what you'd expect out of the biggest business in the world, because it's painful for the people that end up making the decisions behind closed doors. They had appropriators and the leaders. And the more that is cloaked, the more it makes it to where you get the one was 4,100 pages, wasn't it the year before? Dropped in at 1:40 in the morning with 2 days to read through it. I mean, that's pitiful. And you really need to hold the folks that have been running the place accountable. We just point it out and don't seem to make much progress, but not one hearing on what the budget committee should have been about.
Yes.
There's a race on for GOP leader. Is it disqualifying if someone votes for this omnibus part one to be the leader?
Well, so the way I think about it is the public wants a change. The public's fed up with this. I'm up for election this year. I do a lot of speeches around the state of Florida, and people are mad. They're mad about how Republicans have represented them. They're mad that Republicans have gone along with the Biden agenda, passed these omnibuses. They're mad that Republicans have not stood up to get the border secure, not stood up to reduce inflation. So I think, the public is going to be very engaged this year to make sure we get leadership that represents the Republican voters all across the country.
Just to respond to that, none of us can speak for more than ourselves, and I won't purport to speak for anyone other than myself here. To me, it's very troubling. If somebody wants to be our leader, this is exactly the kind of problem that many of us have been frustrated with. I myself find this sufficiently frustrating. This particular bill, this type of process, this is emblematic of other processes that have repeated themselves over and over again throughout much of the 13 years since I've been here. Big bill, important bill, expensive bill, consequential bill, negotiated largely in secret by a small handful of people, released to the public just days before the first votes are expected to occur on that. No amendment process, rubber stamp passage without Senate Republican leadership standing up for the procedural rights of individual members, let alone standing up for the Senate Republican Conference official position on earmarks, which is against them, considering that this bill has 650 pages and 6,000 plus earmarks costing $12.7 billion. I'd say that's a problem. For me, that's darn near, it may well be a disqualifier. If it's not completely disqualifying as far as where I would cast my vote for a leader, I'd at least want to hear a darn good explanation as to how this bill is somehow a departure from how he or she, meaning the individual candidate for the leader position, would want to run the conference.
Yes.
On that same note, some of your House Republican colleagues who have been messaging similar points about earmarks have actually called for Leader McConnell to step down now rather than wait until November. Obviously, between now and November, there's going to be negotiations about a fiscal year 25 budget as well. Do you think Leader McConnell should step down from his leadership post now?
I ran against him, so I clearly thought at the end of the last election cycle we ought to have a change. The way this place is being operated, where we basically Republicans, there's a few Republicans that vote with Democrats to pass an omnibus or pass any of these spending bills. Then I mean, I think I can just tell you the public's mad. Go around the country, people are mad. So I think we need new leadership. What we're doing the week of the 18th is what you would do in a business. What we're doing on the 18th is we're asking the conference to come together and say, what do we stand for? Do we really stand for being against earmarks? Do we actually care about balancing the budget? I mean, there's a lot of things. We ought to say, this is, if we're going to be a Republican in the Senate, what do we stand for? Once you do that, you can figure out who your leader ought to be, because all the leader is going to do is implement what the conference wants. In my business life, and I built a variety of businesses, we decided what our mission was, and then we decide who we'd hire. Yes.
Given that the government is facing a funding deadline on Friday night, are any of you planning on objecting to expedited passage of this package of bills?
It's the only way. We'll decide. I think each of us will decide on our own what we're going to do. But what we've learned up here is the only way you get an amendment vote is to be an objector. I mean, they don't. What I'm fascinated that I read the Constitution. I thought coming up here that I actually would get to vote on what I wanted to vote on. If I can't talk you into it, that's my fault. But if I don't even get a shot at improving something, that's leadership's fault. And so what they've trained us, I've been up here 5 years, I've been trained, the only way you get an amendment vote is be a pain in the butt.
Have any of your Republican conference colleagues put in similar earmarks to, you mentioned Schumer, you mentioned Pelosi, you mentioned the thing that was crossed out, BDSM, something, but, have any of your colleagues participated in this?
You can look at the list.
All of them, or some of them, have in the past, even though the conference is technically against them. It's all public information.
Thank you, guys.
Prior to 2019,
Go ahead.
prior to 2020, we saw under President Trump and at some points a Republican-controlled Congress, we saw the debt go up, we saw deficits go up. If President Trump is reelected, what do you think would be different this time around?
Look, first of all, we're in a position where the laws of mathematics are catching up with us. If President Trump is elected, and I hope he is, we will by that point almost certainly have crossed the threshold of $1 trillion a year in interest on our national debt. When President Trump took office, it was, I think, less than a third of that. So the laws of mathematics are catching up to us. Just that delta between where it was when he took office and where we will be if he's sworn in as the 47th president of the United States. That's roughly on par with what we spend on defense in a year, just that delta. And in fact, I think what we're spending on interest on national debt is itself now in excess of our defense spending. When even the delta is on par with that, that gets really disconcerting. So I would hope that we wouldn't repeat that mistake. But here again, a lot of it relates to procedure and earmarks. Earmarks are a small percentage of overall federal outlays, but they are very often what's driving the excessive federal outlays. And a lot of this really stems back, and then a lot of that also relates to process. The fact that we don't have enough process there means that we can't ferret out what's, fish from fowl, wheat from tares. When we look at these earmarks, the staggering size of the bill and even of just the 650 pages or so of the 6,000 earmarks, is itself so staggering that you can't walk all the way through that in just a few days. There's an old expression that if everyone's family, no one is. There's a variation of it that says if everything is urgent, then nothing is. All this stems back from a problem many decades in the making, and it's a problem that both political parties have tragically contributed in a material way. We've stopped to ask the question, what is it that this government is supposed to do? This document, the United States Constitution, tells us what we're supposed to be about. We're a limited purpose federal government, not a general purpose national government. So it's not our job to legislate on all matters whatsoever, to do things just generally that are a good idea. That is the type of legislative authority typically wielded by a state. States have general purpose legislative jurisdiction. They may act except where they're prohibited from acting or where we have acted within our scope and preempted them from doing so. With theirs, it's the opposite. They're presumed to have the authority to act, except in those circumstances where they're not allowed to. The areas where we are authorized to act are relatively limited. Nearly all of them found in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. It covers things like immigration and naturalization, weights and measures, trademarks, copyrights, and patents, postal roads, bankruptcy laws, regulating trade or commerce between the states with foreign nations, with Indian tribes, declaring war, armies, navies, national guards, granting letters of marque and reprisal, federal public land management. That's about it. There are a few others, but that's more or less the universe. So why in the Sam Hill are we having these discussions about $1 million for this entity, $2.5 million for kayaking and slalom experiences, $3.5 million for parade float construction? There is no parade float construction article of the U.S. Constitution in Article 1, Section 8 or any other provision of it I can find, nor is there anything that would be deemed necessary and proper to parade float construction in there. So I would ask the question, how far can we do this? The laws of mathematics are catching up with us. By the time Donald Trump takes office as president, if he does, which I hope he does, we will be sufficiently deeply mired in this pit that we'll have no choice but to do this. It's better to start this process now than to wait until we're even deeper in the pit, and that's why we're fighting so hard on this bill.
And one quick recap of what you just asked. To me, it was easy to figure out shortly after I got here, because your point was this has been going on with Republicans and Democrats. Earlier I mentioned it got started when we put 2 wars on the credit card. We were only $5 trillion in debt before the Bush administration. And once one side starts rolling, I call it the unholy alliance that starts to unfold. I've mentioned that since the time I've been here, but then that involves what I think is the most important thing we do as a government, defend our country. But I believe defense ought to be held accountable, ought to do budgets, ought to be audited. If you're asking the other side to do all the cutting and you want your stuff, they are unapologetic about it. We call ourselves fiscal conservatives and then roll over, get rolled, because we won't hold the part that's most dear to us accountable. This never gets fixed until you get rid of the unholy alliance and everyone says we're going to budget. If you need more for defense, run it through the proper ways to do it. If you need more domestically, do it. Please don't do it where we continue to borrow money from our kids and grandkids. Thank you.